Good evening. My name is Sandra Lipton, and I'm president of the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta. Welcome to our first online program, Farmers, Peddlers, Philanthropists, and More, the Jewish Experience in Southern Alberta. Originally scheduled as a live presentation in partnership with the Calgary Public Library, it has been recreated as a digital event, and a recording will be made available on YouTube. Tonight's program celebrates Jewish History Month through excerpts of personal reflections compiled from the 50 oral histories recently completed through our Voice of Experience project. This project was made possible by a grant from the Alberta government through the Alberta Historical Resources Foundation. With the addition of these 50 interviews, each with a completed transcript, our archival holdings now include 250 oral histories. As a self-funded organization, recording, preserving, and presenting local Jewish history, we most gratefully acknowledge our members, donors, and granting agencies for their support of our work today, and our 27 life and legacy donors for their commitment to ensuring that our history is preserved in the future. We are thrilled tonight that almost 100 households have joined us for tonight's session. Reminder that while we have turned everyone's video and sound off, you can use chat to send comments and questions to us. We will personally respond to any questions as soon as possible. Please now enjoy the funny, zany, and touching stories shared tonight by Project Coordinator Judy Shapiro and our wonderful readers, Zina Dubinsky, Lawrence Ellman, Tracy Smith, and Gary Silberg.
The Jewish community of Calgary and Southern Alberta had its beginnings in the late 1800s. Most of the early immigrants arrived from Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, Poland. They came to escape persecution and in search of opportunity. And those who came in the first influx between 1900 and 1910 started out as farmers, peddlers, and merchants. At one time, in almost every small town in Alberta, there was a general store run by the one and only Jewish family in town. In the 1920s, the Jews constituted over 2% of the Calgary population. Today, it's less than half of that, around 0.6%. The reflections you are about to hear will give you a sense of the community, the wonderful characters who are a part of it, and their varied contributions to Alberta. The images accompanying the stories were provided by the interviewees or are from the photo collection of the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta, or they are used with permission. We begin. Dr. Ted Beshakin's parents came to Canada around 1910. The now retired obstetrician gynecologist told a story which is familiar to many immigrants.
When they came to North America and landed in Halifax, they were asked, "What's your name?" "Shumiacher." "Well, how do you spell that?" And the guy says, "Okay, we'll call you Smith." So originally when the family came, they were Smith, all of them. So of the 4 boys, 2 reverted to Shumiacher. That's Abe, the oldest son, who became a lawyer, and Morris Shumiacher, from Smith Built Hats Company. He was Smith for a while, and then he went back to being Shumiacher.
That's right. The famous Smith Built Hat Company was founded by the Shumiacher family. With the almost total ban on Jewish immigration from the 1930s to the end of the Second World War, the next wave of immigration consisted of survivors of the Holocaust who had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Ruth Perkovic was born in a displaced persons camp in Europe in the aftermath of World War II. Her parents had survived the Holocaust, but had both lost many family members. Ruth shared the story of how her mother, Faber Gombinski, located her brother, Vega's brother, who had immigrated to Canada prior to the war.
My mother got someone to write in the newspapers that Faber Gombinski, nee Zistblad, is looking for her brother Zisha. And the last she's known is he's in Calgary, in Canada. but she didn't know where. And Ida, Zesha's daughter, my cousin Ida of blessed memory, was just learning how to read. And my uncle used to give her the newspapers. Read this, read it to me, I'm busy. And she says, hey, Dad, there's a Fega Gombinski nie Zisblot, it says, is looking for Zesha Zisblot. He said, what? Fega is alive? He was sure that everyone was gone. And he said, she was the weakest, you know, and one of the youngest. Of course, right away, he started doing the paperwork and sending them stuff. And that's how they got to Canada.
Richard Bronstein's parents were also Holocaust survivors. They came to Canada in 1948 as laborers on a farm outside Brooks. Richard described their first days in Canada.
We got off the ship in Montreal and got on a train, and the train took us across the country. Because we had relatives in Winnipeg, we stopped for a couple of days in Winnipeg, and then back on the train, and got all the way out to Brooks, Alberta. My parents, all of their lives, they said, how can you be on a train for 5 days traveling and still be in the same country? Like, what kind of country is this, you know? It's so big. And also in those days, the farm we were put on, there was no electricity. There was no roads. There was nothing. We lived in an uninsulated farmhouse and had a wood stove in the kitchen. That was our heating.
And that was in 1948. In later years, the Jewish community of southern Alberta welcomed internal immigrants from Montreal and immigrants from around the world, from South Africa, Argentina, Israel, as well as the former Soviet Union, where Jews were not allowed to practice their religion freely. Even when emigration from the former Soviet Union was finally allowed in the 1970s, the government made it very difficult for anyone wanting to leave. This is Anna Gelt's story.
We applied to leave the country in 1975, but Jacob couldn't get a security clearance. He worked for a security firm, and when we applied to leave, we received consult with one very high up person who said, you're wasting your time. You'll never get permission to leave. It will take at least 5 years before he could get the clearance. It was very unfortunate because we should have consulted with this person before we applied, because both of us lost our jobs. We were considered betraying the country by applying. We lost our house, so we moved with our parents. It wasn't the house that we owned. It was the house that we rented through the government. But once they found out that's what we did, they kick you out right away. So it was a little bit tough.
Stephen Krasnow's story is representative of those who chose to come here because of the political situation in Quebec. Stephen's Montreal-based business primarily provided services in oil, gas, and mining.
The separatists got in 76. We said we're not investing in Quebec anymore because of their policies toward industry. And in the late 70s, all was looking rosy in one direction, up in Alberta. And we said, if we're going to move, it's not about Toronto, it's about Alberta. So we moved our modest head office of 6 to Calgary. 900 people in the whole company by that time, but the head office was only 6, and we moved the head office to Calgary in 1981.
Stephen eventually volunteered his time to become the chair of the Calgary JCC and Calgary Jewish Community Council. Later immigrants, like Stephen, brought skills and businesses with them, but that was not true of the early immigrants. Many of our ancestors began their lives in Canada as peddlers or merchants. Gertrude Kohos told a wonderful story of how her grandfather started out in Cape Breton.
He ends up in Montreal. He needs work. And he goes to the guy who runs all the peddlers. Now, this is my understanding of how it works. You owe him the money, he gives you the goods, and he sends you to an area. And at that point, the mines were just opening up in Cape Breton. And my grandfather goes to Cape Breton as a peddler. He ends up in the winter, caught up in the Cape Breton highlands. And he stays with a family there. And it's wonderful because he learns English. Except When he comes back to Montreal the next spring to deal with the peddler boss, he discovers he didn't learn to speak English. He learned to speak Gaelic.
Phil Ullman's grandfather was also a peddler at first. Friends in Edmonton helped set him up.
Well, you'll be a junk dealer. We'll give you a horse, and you'll go around and pick up stuff and do junk. So he had a horse called Jimmy. And so my grandfather was a wonderful man, very generous, very pious. He was very committed to the Jewish people, but he didn't have any sense of direction. So he used to go out in the morning with the horse, and they would go wandering around to the farmers, seeing what pieces of steel they could pick up, buy and sell. And apparently at the end of the day, he just drops the reins and says to the horse, "Jimmy, go home." And Jimmy goes home.
Many Jewish Albertans started out homesteading around 1910, 1920. At the time, the government was offering quarter sections of land at a reasonable price to attract people to Western Canada. One of those homesteaders was Sam Hannon. His daughter, Ayala Manelson, told his story.
They were given land. They came on a cattle boat. He was a young teenager at the time. And the ruling was they had to build a structure on the land they were given within the year. Well, they got there late in the fall, and there wasn't time to put up a structure. So they dug a hole in the ground, and they lived underground for that first winter. And the story is told, and it was verified to me, that Mr. Engel, if he had not come by on his horse, sort of early spring, and moved away the snow and found them there, and realized that they were out of supplies, and brought them food, they might have starved. But the beautiful, well, for me, and very meaningful episode that I had with my father that ties in with that is that because they had failed in farming, whenever he accumulated some money, he would buy a ranch. And as he accumulated more money, he'd buy a nicer ranch. And the last ranch that he had was a very big, beautiful one, the Elkhorn Ranch.
Sam Hannon ended up being a very successful businessman in Calgary. His wife, Lena Hannon, owned a chain of ladies' wear stores called the Betty Shop, and she gave many young Jewish women their first jobs at that store. Most quickly gave up the farming experience. Others were more successful, but it was a hard life. Doreen Klein described her mother's typical day.
They planted wheat, and they had people come and work for them. So my mother had somebody called Lisa helping her. So there was breakfast in the morning at 6 o'clock, sandwiches at 10. They made them and sent them out to the workers. 12 o'clock, they came in for lunch. 3 o'clock, sandwiches again. 6 o'clock, they came in. They went out again, and when the sun went down, it was dark. At 10 o'clock, they came back, and they had, I don't know what you'd call it, a late dinner. And then after that, they used to bring out whatever musical instruments they had and sing.
Several Jewish families were in the cattle business. Sheila Burmack's father, Sam Klein, traveled around southern Alberta, purchasing cattle from the ranchers. Some he kept in feedlots until selling them to the packers.
He did a lot of business with the Hutterites, and I think they kept some of the cattle for him too. He had others, Americans, that bought cattle from him. And eventually, Canada Packers approached him to buy cattle for them. And I think he was the first Jew that ever worked for Canada Packers.
Many immigrants were shopkeepers in small towns, where they worked hard to maintain their Jewish connections through intercity Jewish service organizations, such as the women's group Hadassah. Myra Paperny told great stories about growing up as one of the only Jewish families in Ponoka.
Ponoka was, I didn't know this until many years later, it was settled primarily by Scandinavians. So I think there were only 2 kids in the whole school with dark, dark hair, and I was one of them. I had light skin, but almost black hair. And I look at some old pictures at times, and I see a lineup of the class, and there's me with my dark, dark brown curls. But in central Alberta at that time, there was like a Hadassah organization where they met at least once a month. My mother was president for a number of years, and there were a fair number of Jews in Camrose, and there were Jews in Wetaskiwin, and there was one family in Lacombe. And there was the Lawrence family. They owned what was called a department store in Red Deer. And once a month, the women would have a Hadassah meeting, and the men would play cards, and whoever was the host and hostess would have a dinner. So in central Alberta, Jewish communities still existed.
Both Medicine Hat and Lethbridge had thriving Jewish communities with as many as 75 families. Synagogues, businesses, youth groups, women's organizations, men's organizations, the works. Sadly, both those communities have shrunk, and now there are very few Jewish people living in either of them. Both communities have sold their synagogues because there just aren't enough people to hold services. Gary Kahn's family came from Russia and settled in Medicine Hat.
They had the general store in Suffield, and my dad was a fur trapper. He quit school in grade 8 and had to support the family. He was the only one who spoke English properly, so he quit school, loaded a sack of furs on his back, and made his way to New York to the fur auction when he was 16 years old. He trapped them himself, muskrat, beaver, and then he came back and he became a sheep rancher and then got in the ladies' ready-to-wear business. So that's what he was doing in Medicine Hat. He had 2 stores, the Mayfair and the Sterling.
David Prasso had wonderful memories of growing up in Medicine Hat.
Medicine Hat had, as I look back, a phenomenal Jewish community. We had maybe 25 to 35 families, various sizes of family units. Some had kids, some didn't. But it was a very close and very active community. It was like one family. Everybody knew everybody else's business, and they talked all the time. The Jewish community was close, and every Friday night and every Saturday we went to shul, to synagogue. And my dad would sit with his cronies, and they would talk bridge the whole time, or whatever else it was. And that's how it was.
Dan Shapiro was one of the few Jewish people who grew up in Lethbridge and returned after university. During his childhood, many of the stores on the main street of Lethbridge were Jewish owned, and some of those were shmata, or clothing businesses.
My mother was an amazing woman. She would look after the house in the morning, feed my brother and I lunch. She'd get on the bus, the 10 to 1 bus, be downtown at 1 o'clock, work with my father, get on the 5 o'clock bus, be home at 5:30, and dinner would be ready at 10 after 6. Dad closed at 6 o'clock and he would come home, and it was a ritual like that. And I was brought into the business when I was 12 years old to start packing goods and cleaning hats and vacuuming suits. And then I went on the sales floor. And from the age of 18 to the time I graduated law school at 25, they would only take a holiday knowing I was looking after the store. My dad had an absolute photographic memory. So, for instance, he would have rural customers come in once a year after harvest when they had money in their wallets. And they would buy clothes, basically for the year. And if they needed clothes in the spring, they would come in and Dad would say, we'll charge it and you can pay me after harvest. There was no charge cards back then, right? So the wife would come in sometime around Father's Day, let's say, and say, Albert, what size shirt does Joe wear? Dad would close his eyes and he'd go, 1634. And he knew his waist size and his pant leg and his hat size, and he had it all up here. And he'd only see him once a year.
Aside from being a successful lawyer, Dan's claim to fame is that he designed costumes for 4 local rock bands in the 60s. He wanted to be a fashion designer, but his mother wouldn't entertain that idea for a moment. And by the way, his buddy Gary Kahn, the one whose father was a fur trader, he played at the Depression Coffee House in Calgary and actually played with the Irish Rovers and Joni Mitchell. Now we're going to talk about Calgary a bit. Here, the original Jewish community was centered in East Calgary. Until the 60s, the Jewish institutions were all downtown. Now, of course, they've all moved south. Lila Midlarski was born in Calgary in 1940, and she remembered how poor her family was when she was a child.
For the first 8 years of my life, we lived in the back of our store that was at 333 8th Avenue Southeast. And we were really poor, but Mom was the original who could make something out of nothing. I don't ever remember going hungry. I can still remember the little hovel we lived in, and it was just so tiny. We had one little cubicle for a toilet that was no wider than maybe 2 feet, and all it had was a toilet. We had no bathtub. I remember to give me baths, and then my sister Reba, when she was born, in a tub, my mom would have to boil water on a little stove, and that's how we would have our baths. And it became a ritual Sunday nights. I remember it was just one room, and there was a door that led from our living quarters into my dad's store, and the bedroom was sort of partitioned off with a sheet. I remember my parents' bed, and I had a little bed off to the side, and when Reba was born, there was a little crib on the left, and I remember waking up every morning, and my dad would be carrying out a little mousetrap with a dead mouse.
Lila's father owned a second-hand store, but he was also a tailor.
Dad was known for making cowboy shirts out of satin, and being close to the Stampede grounds, it was really big sellers. He made his own designs, and one of the features of his cowboy shirts was a placket, and that gave the shirts an extra, different feature. You can take the placket off, and it was a plain cowboy shirt, but with the placket on, it gave it sort of bling.
Most Jewish Albertans thrived in their new homes, making a decent living, managing to educate their children so they would have better lives than they did. However, we heard many stories about anti-Semitism. We heard about the first Jewish people to break down the barriers and join various clubs in Calgary, including the Glencoe. And we heard stories of anti-Semitic incidents that were more personal. Phil Libben said,
I remember there was a family that I used to play with all the time named Plotkins. They lived on the hillside on 5th Street there, just before Elbow Drive. And I used to play with them all the time in my yard in the back alley. One day Marie said to me, I can't play with you anymore. And I said, why not? And she said, because you killed Christ. And I remember my retort, I said, how can I kill him if I don't even know him?
Zelda Dean's family was the only Jewish family in Stettler when she was growing up.
My dad's store was on Main Street in Stettler. Much of the time when we lived there, it was a nice small town with a surrounding area of farmers. And my father supported so many of those farmers through dry years, where he would give them food and they would give him chickens and cows. That's the way it worked. And he was loved by all of them. But I remember being called many bad names and being chased home from school, a little girl being chased home. And I remember one time running in the back door of my father's store. I remember being terrified, being chased home again. So I ran in the back door crying. And I remember my dad looking at me and saying, honey, at some point you have to face them. And he took me to the front door where they were, and he put me outside the door. Now, I'm sure it wasn't quite like that, but that's in my little girl memory. And I just remember crying, and here's all these kids pushing me and taunting me, and I just remember putting my fist up like this when they came at me, and I broke a kid's nose. Well, then I was the hero, and everybody wanted to be my friend. But I didn't want to be their friend. They weren't nice people.
It was experiences like that that later led Zelda to create theater groups with the dual purpose of entertaining, but also bringing people of various backgrounds together. She was the founder of an amateur theater company called the Beth Israel Players. From 1971 to 1986, they put on 29 plays. Then she went on to launch the professional Glenmore Dinner Theater. Zelda had loads of great stories, but we have to share this one about the production of Playing for Time, which tells the story of how some Jewish prisoners were saved by playing in an orchestra in the Auschwitz concentration camp.
I did Arthur Miller's Playing for Time at the New Central Memorial High School Theater. When we were auditioning, two women came in that had no theater experience at all. They didn't know each other, came at separate times, not Jewish, and begged to be in the show. They had nothing to offer, but there was a group in that large cast that didn't have to talk, and something in me said, these women need to do this for some reason. And so I let them in. I brought a number of survivors in to come talk to the cast. And they came in and they started talking. And these two women who were sitting at opposite ends of the room, all of a sudden, both of them burst into tears and flew out of the room to the washroom. And I had wondered why. So I went out there. And, well, to cut to the quick, one of their fathers had been a guard at that camp. One of their fathers had been a prisoner. And they both felt independently that by being in this production, they could find some place to come to peace with this. They ended up being friends. Isn't that amazing? You wonder what theater does, right? It connects people in a way that no other medium can.
Well, a number of those interviewed noted personal experiences with anti-Semitism. As a whole, the Jewish community has had its challenges with hate. Ricky Halick was responsible for community relations for Calgary Jewish Community Council, now Calgary Jewish Federation. She talked about the 1996 incident that was the most traumatic and potentially most devastating.
So a package was delivered to the Jewish National Fund office upstairs at the Calgary Jewish Community Center, and the secretary opened it and it detonated. But just the detonator detonated. So there was a flash, but the whole package didn't explode, just the exploding device.
The secretary was mildly injured, but it could have been so much worse.
So it created a lot of fear. I called 911, and when they arrived, we locked down the building. I called my president at that time, who was Cheryl Shore. There was media all around because, well, of course, they listened to the police reports. And Cheryl got there, and I'm at the door not letting anybody in. And Cheryl wants to give me this big hug, but there's media everywhere. So we had this famous handshake because we didn't want to appear, and right away, the media was calling and I said, it's too early. We have no statement to make because we didn't want to speculate. It was mainly dealing with our community, which was really tough. And then keeping everybody, calm and in perspective. Then dealing with the police, all levels of police. And CSIS were there and local police.
Hal Jaffe, a past volunteer president of the community and for many years the volunteer community relations chair, provided some insights about the kinds of issues the community faced. He refers to the Keegstra affair, the incident where a social studies teacher in Eckville, Alberta, Jim Keegstra, was teaching students that the Holocaust didn't happen and that there was a Jewish conspiracy to control the world. Hal also refers to Aryan Nations, a white supremacist group that was active in Alberta.
The 80s and 90s were not an easy time for the Jews of Calgary. And we dealt with a lot of issues, and I think I'd like to say we did it, but we did the community service and justice and built a stronger Calgary and Alberta because of it. The highlight might have been chasing the Aryan nations out of Alberta with the help of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, but it was a group of dedicated Calgarians who took them on. And we made it. We made their situation uncomfortable enough that they left. The Keekstra affair as well, but that was more of a court case that we were just helping with. We helped the courts, we provided expertise to the courts, and helped strategize and spent a lot of time dealing with media relations related to it. But with the Aryan nations and the skinhead groups that were operating here, we actually took the initiative and got rid of them.
Hell also became involved in the national organization, Canadian Jewish Congress at the time. He highlights the Congress's work fighting for the rights and freedoms of all Canadians.
I chaired the Community Relations Committee, I think 6 years of that. And through that, we did what we did locally, but we did it on a national scale. Instead of the Aryan nations here, we were dealing with the Ernst Zundels and the David Irvings, and we were dealing with that kind of vicious anti-Semitism on a national basis. But we also got involved in non-Jewish causes. Principal among them, I think, in the mid-90s was the Canadian Jewish Congress Community Relations Committee became an intervener in the Delwyn Bren case at the Supreme Court of Canada that made it contrary to the Human Rights Act here to discriminate against people for being gay. We also got involved in the turban debates about whether a practicing Sikh could wear a turban in the RCMP. And we were successful in that too. And a number of other non-Jewish initiatives that I think made Canada a better place. It certainly made Alberta a better place.
Although the Keekstra era was a very difficult time for the Jewish community, some good did come of it. Ron Gitter, who was an MLA at the time, later a senator, was asked by then Premier Peter Lougheed to head a committee to investigate issues of tolerance and understanding within the educational system. Here's what he said about that commission.
The Keekstra one was a fascinating experience because we were just in all kinds of communities. We were in Hutterite colonies, we were in Indian reservations, we were in northern communities, and we traveled every corner of this province and met with people. And when I say we were getting into the psyche of Albertans as much as you can, we certainly did. So it was a wonderful experience, and our report is still quoted in the schools, even though it came out in, I think, about 1983. But I still have people that are educators come to me and still talk about it. So it was one of those reports that didn't gather dust. We changed a lot of the curriculum, we changed a lot of the books. We closed down some private schools that were just indoctrination centers. And so it had a lot of impact, and it was worth the time, and it was a great education. It really was. It was a great education.
The Keekstra case, of course, brought the Holocaust to public awareness. As a result, many Holocaust survivors, and there were about 20 here in Calgary at one time, decided to start telling their stories in order to counter Holocaust denial. That was the beginning of the Holocaust Education Symposium, which is now in its 36th year. Every year, 3,000 Calgary high school students or more attend the symposium and learn about this period in history. Not all the survivors, though, were willing or able to tell their stories. Eva Hoffman spoke about her family's experience.
They didn't really, well, for some reason, they didn't share. Because I think after the Holocaust, they really didn't want to burden my brother nor myself with what had happened. And I think they were one of the few people I know who wouldn't accept reparations. I think there was probably always an undertone. And the undertone was just that they had suffered. They were happy, and there was laughter, but there was always an undertone. I think it definitely had an impact on us because you were protecting. Like I was protecting them, they were protecting me. I was always the one to write the letters, like to relatives, wherever, even if I wrote them in Yiddish. I think I was the go person for them. although they were perfectly capable of doing things themselves. But there still was always the hesitancy on their part because they were new to the country. And I think there was always the fear that they could be sent back.
One of the most touching stories we recorded came from former Calgarian Saul Kashitsky, who told an amazing story about the time he and his wife Mira found the woman who had saved Mira during the Holocaust.
When Mira was chairman of the Canadian Jewish Congress, she went on trips to Hungary, but once I went with her. We went to Slovakia, and we went to visit the village. Mira had a picture of the people who saved her, so she stopped people on the street and said, "Do you know anybody?" They stopped an old lady, and they thought the old lady would remember. Nothing. Then a young lady comes up and says to her, "Can I help you?" And Mira says, "Yes, I am looking for this family called Turchov, and this is a picture." And the lady says, "Jesus, Mary, it's my mother." And she took us to the house. When we went to visit this older lady, she looks at Mira and her sister and says, "My children." And they got talking, and the lady says, "Do you remember the drummer?" So Mira says, "I do remember the drummer." So the way it worked in villages in those days, radios were not allowed. So a drummer would come in the public square, drum, and do an announcement of the things for the day. And she says, "Do you remember that a drummer came and made an announcement and said, 'Anybody that's hidden Jews, better give them away because you could be punished.'" And as he was drumming and reading this, "Give away the Jews," he was going with his head like this, shaking his head side to side. And the lady says, "You know, everybody in that village knew that we were hiding you." He knew too, and he was sort of saying, "I know, but don't give them up." Isn't that amazing? And do you know what the lady said to me after that? She said, "I don't know if this would be true today." Those were her final words.
Just before we change the subject, I want to correct something that I may have said. There were approximately, or actually more than 100 Holocaust survivors in Calgary at one time. And now we're going to change to a lighter note. In our interviews, we heard lovely love stories. During the Second World War, over 350 Jewish men and women from southern Alberta enlisted in the Canadian Armed Forces. A number of those posted overseas found their life partners in England. Annette Green Burmack's mother was one such war bride.
So she was a war bride on the war bride's train, right to Medicine Hat. Got off in a blizzard and said she was going back. This was not for her. But she never went back. They met at a dance in Bournemouth, England. My dad was on leave and my mom was on vacation. And he asked her to dance, and that was it. He was enamored with her. Maybe it was the accent. Who knows? But before he got shipped back to Canada, he asked her to marry him. And there was, 3 or 6 months between. I remember my mom saying, when she was with him in England, he had a full head of hair. And by the time she got off the train in Medicine Hat, he was bald. She wanted to know where the hair went. It wasn't him. My mom came from a well-to-do family, so she had no cooking skills, no home skills. She had had servants all her life, and then came to the backwoods of Medicine Hat. She told me stories about cooking her first Shabbat meal. She put the chicken in the pot, put the pot in the oven. Nobody told her that the feathers had to come off. Nobody told her you had to clean it. Nobody told her anything. And all of a sudden there was smoke coming out the windows, and my dad came running up because they lived over top of the shoe store there. And he went running up and he threw the chicken right out the window.
Then there was the story of how Walter Moskowitz almost missed his own wedding to his beloved Jessie of blessed memory. Walter and Jessie were both living in Montreal at the time, but the wedding was in Calgary.
When we told the caterer we had a date already in Calgary, we got married on December 27th. He said, you know, we always get snowstorms in Montreal on Christmas Day, and you're not going to be able to get to Calgary. I said, you've got to be kidding. So Jessie came to Calgary, taking my mother as hostage about a week before the wedding. And sure enough, this guy was right. We got a 50-centimeter snowfall. I was on duty until December 24th. December 24th, December 25th, there was 50 centimeters of snow, and the Montreal airport was completely closed. There were no flights. I wasn't going to get out of Montreal. So I called Jessie, and her younger sister Leslie answers the phone. Okay, can I speak to Jessie? Why? Because I can't get to Calgary. And she screams out, Jessie, he's not coming. So I ended up taking a train. So it was myself, my dad, my brother, and my sister-in-law. We went by train from Montreal to New York. This is Boxing Day now. We're getting married on the 27th. And we're able to get a flight from New York City on Boxing Day to San Francisco. And then San Francisco to Calgary. And I get here late on Boxing Day, and I had not met her dad yet. So because of the snowstorm in Montreal, I never met my future father-in-law until the wedding procession the next day, and we met outside the synagogue sanctuary in the hallway. So we're lining up for the procession, and I was wearing a top hat because that was standard practice in Montreal for the groom. And my future father-in-law, Morris, says, "You're not wearing that top hat." And I replied, "I am wearing this top hat." And he says, "No, you're not wearing this top hat, not in Calgary." And we argued back and forth, and I stood my ground, and Morris relented, and I wore my top hat, as you can see in any of our wedding pictures. And then he hands me a double scotch, and he says, "Drink this, and you'll do much better walking down the aisle." And then the procession starts.
There were some very colorful characters in the Jewish community of Southern Alberta. Gary Kahn talked about the Jewish mayor of Medicine Hat, Harry Viner, who served 20 years in public office.
When Harry spoke, he spoke with authority. There was no fooling around. Didn't take a penny salary, donated it back, and brought a lot of industry to Medicine Hat. And he was a showman. He would race a horse in the wintertime or something like that, or arm wrestling, whatever it was. He was a rough, tough, but he was kind, and he had a little bit of wisdom, and he ran an old-fashioned business. It was a hardware store to beat all hardware stores. If ever there was a nut and bolt you couldn't find, Hat Hardware had it. He had a couple of real characters working for him who were great salesmen, and everybody shopped there.
Gary's dad and Harry Viner went to Israel in 1953 and met with the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. Later, Harry sent a dozen sheep from his ranch to Israel to introduce a new strain of hardy sheep to the new country. Calgary was a small town back in the day, and a number of people spoke about their neighbors, who later became famous. Ayala Manelson, for example, grew up next door to Norman Kwong, who became the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta. Alvin Libman spoke about his childhood friend, Peter Lougheed. When Lougheed was Premier of Alberta, he asked Alvin to get involved in the new cancer center at Foothills Hospital. That was a first foray into healthcare that led to many more and continues to be a passion for Alvin.
I was good friends with Peter Lougheed, who was the premier of the province at the time. I lived on 9A Street. Peter Lougheed was one door away from me. So we grew up together playing outside. We were close to the same age. So all my life, we had been friends. And he had a little problem. They were building this new cancer hospital here in Calgary, and the government had planned to spend $35 million. And when the price came in, it was $75 million. And he wanted to try to understand what was going on there. So they created a little bit of a working group, which he asked me to sit on, together with his Deputy Minister of Finance, his Deputy Minister of Public Works, and we had to figure out how to get this back on track and get it done, which we did successfully.
Philanthropy and community service are highly valued in the Jewish community. The early immigrants worked hard to buy land for cemeteries, to build synagogues and schools, to take care of the needy, and raise money for social services at home and in Israel. And they were active in the general community as well. You may be familiar with some of the buildings named for Jewish people: the Jack Singer Concert Hall, the Martha Cohen Theater, the Libin Cardiovascular Institute, the Jenny Belsberg Theater at the Banff Center, the Sheldon Schumer Health Center, and the Carl Safran Center. In addition to support for medicine and the arts, Jewish Albertans serve in community leadership roles. Currently, Carol Ryder is president of the Alberta University of the Arts, and Deborah Yedlin is chancellor of the University of Calgary. Additionally, hundreds of Jewish volunteers sit on boards and work for charitable organizations all over southern Alberta. For that community service, 5 Jewish Calgarians have been awarded the Alberta Order of Excellence, and 23 have received the Order of Canada, including Dr. David Berkeson, Canadian labor, military, and political historian at the University of Calgary.
There are 3,100 people in a nation of 37 million who are companions or fellows of the Order of Canada, and I'm one of them. I can hardly believe it. I couldn't believe it when I got it, and I can't believe it until this very day. I'm very proud of it. Why did they pick me? Why do I deserve this? Whoever nominated me must have written a hell of a letter. At the time, I was very deeply involved in changes that were taking place in the Canadian Forces and the Department of National Defense. It was after the Somali affair, and I worked very hard to try to raise the educational levels of the armed forces, raise the levels of ethos of the armed forces to show them you must begin to reflect the values of Canadian society as they are today. The armed forces should begin to reflect the structure of Canadian society in terms of immigration, in terms of women, in terms of all these sorts of things. And I think that's what I got the Order of Canada for, basically.
Going back to philanthropy and volunteer work, a number of people related stories of the iconic Hadassah Bazaar. Some of you may remember that event, but if you don't, it was an annual bazaar held on the Stampede grounds, and it was a big deal. There were clothing booths, food booths, crafts booths. Arlene Chetner was in charge of books and records. Her daughter Judy explained what that job entailed, beginning with the day the bazaar closed.
First of all, taking everything back down that wasn't sold, organizing that and putting it away. Then the phone calls started the very next day to radio stations and bookstores and music stores to get donations for the next year. And then at a certain point, after we schlepped around and collected and collected and collected, we would, and most of it was kept in our basement at Arlene's house. Then we would sit down, all of us, and take box after box, put it all out on the floor, discuss for hours on end, at length. Is this comic book worth 5 cents or 10 cents? And we take a piece of masking tape and a pen and write down the price of every single item that had to be sold the next year in the books and records department. So we went through every record, every book, and every magazine, and every comic book, and put time and effort. Not just a box and say, okay, everything is a penny, or everything is $1. No, she actually put a lot of thought into organizing. And things were put into categories and sections so that it would be easy to look through on the day of the Hadassah Bazaar.
This presentation wouldn't be complete without a story about another large-scale Calgary event, the Quintessential Calgary Stampede. Lots of people had memories of the Stampede, but Reba Faber's was the best.
We rented out our whole house for the Stampede. We had a 2-bedroom little house on 13th Avenue and Macleod Trail, and every Stampede, my parents would hang out signs, "Rooms for rent for the Stampede." They would subdivide our basement into 2 cots separated by army blankets, and people would rent those cots for the Stampede. We had a little room in the basement that my parents had fashioned into a bedroom. People would rent that. It was higher class. It had a door. We had a cabin in the backyard that my dad had built, and he called it Uncle Tom's Cabin. People rented that. We rented out my brother's bedroom. It wasn't like a real bedroom. It was like a room to go out onto the back, or the room to go out onto the back door and also led to the basement. But it had a curtain in front of it. During the Stampede, my mother's sister and I slept on a pull-out couch in the front room, and my brother and my dad slept on the floor on a mattress. And so we would have sometimes 20, 21 people in our home at night, and our doors were never locked because people would have to come and go during the day. We had 1 bathroom. My parents were both at the store during the day, and then at night, my mom would come home, and if people were leaving, if they only stayed that one night, guess what? My mom had to take off all the sheets, wash them, hang them on the line, if you please. We didn't have a dryer. Iron them and put them back on for the next day for the new people that were coming. And we had people that would come every year. Every year.
Another Calgary institution that attracts repeat visitors is the Little Synagogue at Heritage Park. Several people interviewed are volunteers at the Little Synagogue, including Trudy Cowen.
I think that probably was one of the most important things the Jewish community has done for itself and for intercultural relations in terms of building bridges. That little building talks about and develops relationships about Jews to thousands of people a year. People come in and say, I've always wanted to ask, or is it okay if I ask? And this is a safe place to ask a question, and so they do. And the park found for many years, and it's the 10th year now, the park found that people stay longer in that building and ask more questions in that building than in any other building in the park. And the interpreters there, everybody who works there, paid or otherwise, does it because it's a personal thing with them. It's not just going to work and telling nice stories. There's a real mitzvah, a good deed going on constantly in that building. And I think when I talk to people, wherever I'm traveling, about this little building and what it is doing, Jewish or otherwise, they are really amazed that we did it, because it just doesn't happen anywhere else.
So many things about the Jewish community of Southern Alberta are unique, but in many ways, our history is the universal story of persecution, resilience, and building successful new lives in a new land. Let's close with one more love story, also from Trudy Cowen.
The story is that my great-grandfather came home from synagogue one day on Shabbat with a young man. And the young man stayed for lunch. And after lunch, he and my bubby were in the sitting room, and there was a plate of apples. He was encouraged to take an apple. He took the apple and the knife that was there and cut off a piece and gave her the first piece. And she said, "I knew I was engaged." You know, he was on his best behavior. But it really was a lovely marriage. There are so many family stories about them. She once got testy with him about something and said, "Oh, you're such a fool." And he said, "But once I was smart. I married you."
And once our ancestors were smart, they came to this amazing country. And that brings us to today and the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I'm so pleased that we ended up having 74 households sharing our presentation. We are so grateful to our office staff, our oral history chair, Laura Schuler, our project coordinator, Judy Shapiro, and our narrators for all their work in making this evening's program possible. We are also very much appreciate the support of the many volunteers involved in our Voices of Experience Oral History project, and especially convey our thanks to our interviewees, our interviewers and transcribers, as well as our staff for all the time and effort they contribute to this project. We hope you enjoyed tonight's program and would like to see more online programming highlighting local Jewish history. Any financial contributions and or legacy donations would greatly assist us in preserving our past for the future, especially in these challenging times. Please consult our website for details on membership and legacy gifts, as well as for information on our upcoming programs and all our archival and research resources. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Please tell your friends and family who are unable to join us tonight that this presentation has been recorded and that the video will be made available on our website. Please do not hesitate to contact our office with any questions on local Jewish history. On behalf of the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Alberta, I wish you all